So hello and welcome. I am Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's marketing manager, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's discussion in our Hybrid Innovations webinar series. Today's session is the second in the series on building and leveraging innovation in today's shifting work landscape, and we'll focus on the theme of rethinking the future of virtual work. As we give folks another moment or so to filter in, please test out the functionality of the Q&A and chat features below and share where you are joining us from. I encourage everyone to utilize these features throughout the discussion. I'll be looking at your questions for us to talk through at the end of this session when we've dedicated some time for Q&A, but I can also answer any quick questions throughout. Before I turn things over to Dr. Dan Denison and our guest speakers to get us started, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Dr. Daniel Denison is Denison's Consulting Chairman and founding partner. Daniel Denison's decades-long career as a researcher and a professor, first at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business and then at the International Institute for Management Development in Switzerland, has produced some of the most impactful work in the fields of organizational culture and leadership behavior. Today, he plays an active role in our firm and driving our research and our consulting practice into the future. Dr. Vicki Brown. As a 40-year plus career civil servant, Dr. Vicki Brown is currently serving as the Executive Director of the Office of Strategic Employment and Organizational Development and the Chief Learning Officer for the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. Her responsibilities include leadership and oversight of all education and training programs delivered by the Department of Interior University and Acquisition Institute and online learning delivery via the DOI Talent Learning Management System for more than 70,000 employees worldwide. With a doctorate of education earned from the George Washington University, in her off time, Vicki serves as an adjunct professor at Northeastern University and George Washington University in their doctoral programs. Dr. Rhonda Jones is the CEO and managing member of Human Capital Focus, LLC. In that role, she works with nonprofits to implement and evaluate strategies to develop and engage staff with skills needed to ensure long-term business success. She is also president of the board of Maryland CASA Association, a nonprofit organization associating for children in foster care, and chair of the Howard County Commission for Women. And with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Dan to get us started.
That's great. Thank you, Nellie. And thanks so much to Vicki and Rhonda for joining us today. Really delightful to have our colleagues here to talk with you today, because this is a period in time of really rapid innovation in how people work and in how we get organized to do that. We're all familiar with return to work dynamics and how much flux there is in those right now, especially with Delta variant COVID back at us. But I think that the focus that we want to put in our series through this fall is in what people are learning. What are you learning about creating a high-performance business culture in a hybrid setting? It's particularly important to look at the value that we see in getting together and working face-to-face. We've been going through, all of the research recently. There's a few new things out that we will share with all of you. But in general, it's amazing how little that topic has been studied. What's the value of getting together face to face? And, we've all had a lot of experience with that. And that's one of the key areas of focus of our webinar series. And more importantly, just the innovations that organizations are creating now to move forward, to keep building the culture of their organization, and to keep building that for the future. So those are some of the themes that we're going to pursue through this next series of webinars. But today, we're going to turn things to Vicki and to Rhonda to get some of their overview and experience. And before we dive in, we should also introduce Margaret Gorman, our Vice President of Sales and Marketing, and thank her for her role in putting all this together too. But let's move over to Vicki and Rhonda and get, kind of your perspective. What are the innovations? What are you learning? What can the rest of us learn from what you guys are doing? Thanks so much.
Vicki, I don't know if you want to start or...
You can go first.
So, we're learning so much over this last 18 months. There are just a few things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the future of work. We've heard, so much. Every place you turn, there's another article on the future of work, the future of hybrid work, all that kind of stuff. We're talking about it now. And so I wanted to look at it in terms of not just creative things companies are doing, but leading practices companies should be doing. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, Dan, you asked what we learned, is I've seen organizations appreciate more the importance of strategic foresight. And to me, that's really important because right now, there were companies that were doing things the way they should have been doing all along before COVID came and we ended up in this remote work environment. And what I mean by that is they were taking care of their employees. They were looking at employee engagement, psychological safety, all of those things that became, to the forefront with COVID. But there are organizations who weren't doing that and weren't doing it well, who weren't supporting remote work or telework, virtual work. And so they've been scrambling. And so one of the things I've seen organizations have a lot of success with, and me with my staff, is that leaders looking forward, like way forward, outside of the box, being willing to challenge normal assumptions. And so strategic foresight is really a systematic method of considering and analyzing key trends and drivers of change before you start making plans, right? And I'm not an expert in strategic foresight. I've had training, had my employees go through some training, but when properly used, strategic foresight really helps leaders prepare the organization for different future states. It's not just one path. And by looking at things that, seem outside of the norm. I mean, who would have thought, right? Pandemic, while we've had pandemics before, the medical community was telling us there'd probably be another one, but who would have thought that so many lives would have been lost, that it would have lasted for so long, it's still going on, that it is changing the very way we interact with one another and what we consider important in our lives. Well, if you had done strategic foresight and looked far ahead and tried to think outside of the box, maybe that would have been one of the things you would have considered. And so I see a embracing, or at least more receptivity to looking further down the line, years, in terms of what's coming down the pike, right? And Vicki, feel free to chime in here anywhere you want. I think the two other things I would mention, and that is something I know Margaret and Dan, you can appreciate, Vicki too, because we went to the same doctoral program, is systems thinking. So more and more I hear people talking about, instead of seeing organizations as just a cohesive body, systems thinking helps leaders consider how subcomponents function and how their success or hindrance impacts other subcomponents and the overall health of the organization. And being in human resources, I am thrilled that people are especially taking a look at the employee subcomponents. And the other thing I wanted to touch on was diversity in terms of what we've learned. We've learned that when people are stressed, COVID, the economy, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, political stuff, people lost their jobs, people just under so much, they start to reevaluate their lives. And they also want to find meaning in what they do, not just personally, but at work. And they want to bring their whole selves to the organization. They don't want to have to put on, one hat to go to work and another face when they go home. And so I see organizations not only looking at the normal demographic categories that we think of, race, gender, ethnicity, age cohorts, but now we're starting to look at what they call intersectionality. And how do demographic variables overlap and group? And so I consider myself African-American, Black, female, right? So there's the female group, there's the African-American group, but being an African-American female also is a group. And then I'm blessed, I'm in the over 50 crowd, right? So, being in that age cohort, that group, what does that mean? And considering all of those and letting me, one of the things I love in my role is that I can be myself. I can bring my authentic self, my whole self to the workplace. And managers are learning to deal with that, because before it was, well, to treat everybody fairly and equitably, you had to treat everybody the same way. And we're saying, no, different employees have different needs, and not that you should not afford everybody the same opportunity, but there are different strategies and different things that you have to offer as an organization in order to allow people to blossom. So those are just a couple things that I've learned and I've seen organizations learn over the past 18 months.
Thanks, Rhonda. That's a great lead-in. I think for one of the things that we're learning is that leaders now have to become responsible for organizational and employee safety and their well-being. And while we've always talked about that, I don't think we ever really lived that life of making sure that our folks were well, that they were healthy, that they were resilient. And so we've seen a lot of training focused on resiliency training, how to overcome. We've had a lot of deaths and setbacks with COVID, and the work members are away from the workplace. And for my organization, that's pretty typical, because I have members that are not only in the Washington, D.C. area, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Denver, Colorado, Phoenix, Arizona. So I've had this hybrid environment that we've been working with. But you know what? We never really reached out to those individuals that were external to that box, that office space. And so as a leader, and then leaders in our organization, we've had to learn that we are responsible for the whole office, the whole space, for that organizational safety and well-being. And you made a point about strategic foresight. It's an interesting point, because I think that our leaders thought that this was going to be a short-term pandemic, that in a month or two, we're going back to normal. So they were allowing things to happen in that first month or two or three that they thought they would be able to put a stop to, and then bring everybody back into their workplace, whether that was a remote or in a physical building. And so now they're learning, 15, 16, 17 months later, they need to have a paradigm shift, that they have to figure out how to be in this virtual environment, in this remote environment for the long run, for how are they going to manage this hybrid workforce and bring everybody together. So that leads to a couple of things. How are they going to maximize the use of the space that they're not using now, so that they can use that as a come together space for people who want to come back together? But the other thing is, how do they make sure that they have a pulse of all their employees, irrespective of where they're sitting and what they're doing, and that they don't forget about the ones that are geographically away from the workplace, so that everybody has the same opportunities for advancement, the same opportunity to participate in professional development opportunities, and that they are able to bounce back when they have something that happens in their life, whether it's driven by COVID or some other natural incidents that happens in their life. So I think that, leaders really have had to own up to this whole responsibility for organizational safety and employee well-being, learning that they're in this for the long haul, and they have to make some mental adjustments that now I can't think about what used to be, because what used to be is not going to work. in what we need going forward. And I think we also learned that even though we are remote or virtual, not everybody is adept in technology as we thought they were, because we have a lot of us that are, I want to say baby boomers, that we did a little bit of things with technology, and we have our younger generations that have really embraced that. So now how do we maximize the use of reverse mentoring? You know, how do we have our more younger employees teaching us more seasoned employees how to maximize the use of our technology, and that we can do work anywhere, asynchronously. But we need to make sure that we remember, you know, what's driving the culture of that organization. How do we keep our teams connected to the organization, even though they are physically dislocated from the workplace? So those are just a couple of things that we are learning and that we are experiencing.
Vicki, you brought up a couple of things that I actually had in my notes when you're talking about technology for in this political climate, and the fact that organizations are seeing, right, this move to hybrid work. Instead of being focused on the workforce, the labor force in your local area, you are going to be able to expand the people that you can hire from. They could be anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And you mentioned the technology, right? Some people are adept at technology. The other thing we have to think about is individuals with differing abilities, right? Mm-hmm. That is an untouched labor market. And the fact that companies are moving more to virtual work will help a lot of those individuals who might not otherwise be able to engage in what we would call a normal setting. But the other thing with technology is you have to make sure you have technology that works for all of your employees, because I was working with an organization, and when they had to all of a sudden go virtual. So they're, okay, let's use, and I won't name the virtual platform they were using, but they said, well, let's switch to this, it'll be lower cost and everything. But individuals with visual challenges, they found out later, could not enlarge things as easily. There were all kinds of, and they did not have that employee group at the table when they were making the selection, the technology, like, oh, this is going to be a great thing. It'll save us money, available to more people. Yeah, but can all of your folks take advantage of it and be fully engaged? Because that sets up a barrier. If they aren't, if they can't use it, that sets up an unneeded barrier. And then the other thing you said about supervisors, you know, training them. We still have people who are thinking, if I can't see you, I don't know what you're doing, and how can I properly manage your work, which is insane, right? We're well past that. But getting people to accept that is tough. That's a tough thing to do. So.
Yeah, it definitely is a paradigm shift, and getting them to think about doing that differently. You mentioned technology, you know, and I'm thinking that, you know, right now the administration really wants us to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. But in order to do that, companies and organizations have to think about what's the infrastructure that they have around. Yes. Because what we don't want to happen is to create those who have and those who have not. Because there are a lot of areas across the United States that are challenged with the right kind of technology infrastructure. There are organizations that can't afford the kind of home equipment that individuals need in order to be successful. So along with technology, while it's great and it's underpinning this entire virtual environment that they're in, there are some challenges and opportunities that they need to look at. One thing that the federal government is doing is what they call home office in the box. So they have created this whole workforce 2030. What are we going to look like in the year 2030, and building up to the year 2030, so that you can, if you are a federal employee, and I'm sure that private sector organizations can really take advantage of this, you know, what do you need from us as an organization in order to be successful working at home in a virtual environment? What kind of desk do you need? What kind of computer equipment do you need? What kind of material? And then you can purchase that, and then they'll mail it to your home. And yeah, you're going to have some kind of continued service agreement that you're going to have with the organization, but the organization is not only vested in you if you're in the physical workplace, they're also vested in you in your remote or your virtual workplace. So they bring in that together, your hybrid workplace where everybody has the same advantages, the same accessibility. So those are a couple of things that we're looking at as well.
Vicki, you expressed an idea that I've never thought about before, and I want to focus on that for a minute. You talked about accessibility infrastructure, and that's really how do we create inclusive environments in this virtual world. What have you learned in your own organizations, in the Department of Interior and in the EPA, about your accessibility infrastructure? Where has it worked, and what are the challenges that have come to the surface this last year or so?
That's a great question, Dan. When we moved to a virtual environment, everyone had Teams, everyone had WebEx. A lot of people were moving to Zoom for government. But in the Department of Interior, our bureaus and our headquarters are all independent entities with their own chief information officer. And they all want to do business differently. So trying to bring 70,000 employees onto a Zoom for government platform has not been without challenges. Because we have
Wow.
to, when people think about Zoom and WebEx and Teams, they're looking at their administration kind of employees or white collar workers. But in the Department of Interior, we have such an environmental focused community, whether they're biologists, geologists, hydrologists, they're working out on oil platforms and fisheries and in the park. So how do we help them get connected? And it has not been without issues, because if you go deep down into a park, it's very difficult to get service. I'm in Orlando, Florida, and I'm having a challenge with service. So can you imagine being in one of the parks and trying to connect down to the lowest level of our individuals? So that's been a learning curve that we've had to determine how to figure out. The second thing has been, in my DOI university, we were doing face-to-face traditional courses. We were also doing online courses. So once we pivoted with moving strictly to virtual and instructor-led courses, we learned a couple of things. There's two schools of thoughts on whether virtual environment works in every instance, and we know that it doesn't. However, we have, as a business unit, we've been able to increase the number of course offerings that we've had. We've actually had more participation in a virtual environment than we had before we went to a virtual environment. So now the challenge is, how do we find a balance as we hopefully move out of this pandemic related environment and find a balance between that's working virtually and that we need to do face to face. So that's kind of some of the things that we learned, is not everybody is postured in position or have the architecture or the capability to use the technology that we all kind of take for granted right now.
Yes, and that's a big dynamic in every organization that we work with, is that yes, people are complaining about how many Zoom calls they had and this button and that and the speed and all that. But organizations have people on the front line that don't have that access, that really can't have that same access, that need to be live and in person, face to face. And breakthroughs that will, and you do talk about some where it's, the net's cast more widely. We can, if you're wired in, any place in the world works good, and that's a plus. But, how do we innovate so that we create an infrastructure where it's accessible to everybody, not just the white collar workers, working from home, but also the people that are doing the most important, most difficult work that's on the front line. Rhonda, what do you see in your organization, in the EPA, in terms of the infrastructure that people have to gain access?
So I will refer to some of the nonprofits and other organizations that I work for in terms of the technology and accessibility. So one of the issues that I've seen come up very heavily is getting that technology to people and employees using their own technology versus organizational technology, because then you have some security issues that could arise, right? And to what degree is confidential or we call it PII information, that personally identifiable information, being saved on a system that is not the organization's.
Right.
So we're seeing people think about that. When we talk about where people are around the United States, well, they could be anywhere in the world. So if you allow folks to take their computer overseas, we talked about connectivity issues. Well, depending on where you are in the world, that might not be possible. You might have to use your cell phone instead of your computer, but also security concerns. Mm-hmm. We're seeing, as you have these ransomware attacks and everything in the news, organizations are starting to worry about that. And they're having to strengthen the technology, the core technology, in order to make it accessible to everybody wherever they are. So yeah. Lots of stuff to consider these days that we didn't have to think about before.
Every day it expands. And, and you started out, talking about the strategic foresight, and how do you do that under tremendous pressure to react now and to do it well? What have you learned about how effective leaders have kind of juggled those two pieces, so they're reacting in the moment, but they're doing that with one eye on the future? What are some of the things you've learned from that?
Yeah, so Vicki, you probably know too, but I've seen several federal agencies say, wait a minute, okay, we knew change is a constant, but it's the pace of change, right? So we need to step up our game. And they're engaging senior leaders in bringing in academicians, private industry, understanding that they can't do this all by themselves. So you get these, not just forward thinkers, but also subject matter experts in their own agencies together. There are organizations who have, if you think about it, very technical employees, right? Labs, your security personnel, whatever, they can't work remotely. So you can address, there are things you need to address now, but in order to stay nimble and to be an employer of choice, you have to think down the road. So 10 years, 20 years, what do we think things are going to look like? And it's kind of this, yes, it is a balancing act. Yes, you still have to get the business of the organization done. But I think folks, at least what I'm seeing is senior leaders understand that, hey, we have to make time for this. This is our role. We're accountable to the organization, to our employees, and we have to be more nimble. And for us to do that, we have to see all the possibilities that are out there, even as crazy as they might seem now, because you know what? Some of that stuff is really going to happen. And then how do we best prepare ourselves? We might not choose the path that comes to be, but at least we're thinking that way. And like I said, bringing in people from outside federal agencies I'm seeing a lot of that now.
Yeah, and I want to ditto what Rhonda said. We're working through the federal agency's Future Foresight project right now for our program project managers. And project and program managers cut across all federal agencies. They also cut across the private sector. And so you have to carve out time in order to do that. First, you have the leadership buy-in, but then you have to carve out time to bring people together to do scenarios and what if. So what if this happened in 5 years? What if this happened in 10 years? And then the second order impact of that is looking at those scenarios. Now, how do we close the gaps of the workforce that we have so that they can meet those future predicted scenarios so that they can move from where they are today to 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. So there's a lot of intersection between leadership, between subject matter experts, and then bringing in the learning professionals to say, these are the things that have been identified for down the road. Now, what kind of training, education, professional development, and opportunities do we need to put into place so that we can prepare our workforce to move down that road. Because you don't always want to be hiring from the outside. You want to continue to upskill and reskill the workforce that you have so you can maximize, those employees that are already on staff.
And Vicki, with that, with upskilling and reskilling, I've also seen federal agencies and other organizations also consider the organizational structure, because that's another thing. You may have employees that are in the wrong position, or you may not have the work divvied up with the right individual. So you might need to bring together different categories of job duties or workers or whatever. And I see much more for the federal agencies as they come to understand that employees have a whole lot of choice these days, right? Everywhere you see, somebody's hiring for this or that. So the federal workforce, great, but it's not the only job in town now, especially as more organizations are allowing employees to work from anywhere. And so they are really having to think, okay, how do I bring someone on? In the days of someone, coming in as a human resource specialist and working all the way up to the top, that straight career is rare these days. People might last a couple years here or there. They want to pick up new skills, right? And it may not be necessarily leading to the next rung, but they're interested in this, they're interested in that. And I see federal agencies embracing the fact that, okay, if I can't keep that employee here in, say, procurement, maybe they're good over in marketing, or maybe public affairs or international affairs or whatever. And okay, if I can't keep them in my agency, well, at least we'll keep them within the federal government. So there's that bigger picture view, which is a great thing.
There's a lot of choice. Every study kind of shows that at least half of people are thinking about what's the next job, what's a new job, and this is not going to stop. There's a level of choice. There's preferences. What's normal? Everybody wants to go back to normal. But it's not the same place, we're each going to different destinations, especially if you look at, boomers compared to millennials. What's going back to normal mean for millennial? And what do they see as some of the priorities for building an effective hybrid organization? One of the themes that I think is really interesting is the priority that people are putting on working face to face. When should we get together? Why? What do you see in your agencies in terms of the priorities people are choosing or that are mandated for when you work virtually and when you work face-to-face, direct in person? Live and in person is starting to happen again now. Hybrid meetings themselves, where it's part face-to-face and part, virtual, are also a new challenge and are quite a different animal altogether. But what are you seeing for the priorities for working face-to-face? How's it emerging?
I want to address a comment you made earlier, though, about millennials. What do they want? They want people to recognize that they are a whole person, that they have more skills that they're bringing to the table than that are in that job description that they're having. So agencies have to think a little bit differently, as Rhonda mentioned. Maybe you are an HR specialist and you're in this box, but what else am I bringing to the table? How do leaders help maximize the rest of the skill sets that make me a whole person, so that I can feel that I'm contributing across multiple fronts, not just in this one little narrow box. So that's one thing I think we're learning is, as I talk to my staff, it's like, what else are you interested in? How else can I help you grow other than just the position that you're in? But then to get back to your question about when will people come together, I think that collaboration is important, and coming together to collaborate, to brainstorm, to think strategically, to think through issues. There's always going to be a place for that, but I don't know if we will ever be able to bring everyone back together in a central location, because it's something that we never did anyway to begin with.
Right.
It's extremely
That's right.
important. So you just have to make sure that you have your pulse on the entire workforce. And, you know, we have platforms like this that can help you come together to collaborate, to brainstorm, to look at strategic issues. You know, even if part of the workforce is in, quote, the main location and the rest of the workforce is in virtual and remote, but you have to consider where everybody is or what technology they need in order to be present in the moment where everybody is together, like we are today.
Yeah. And, you know, when can everybody be back in meeting? I think there will still be that space. Some people crave it, right? Love to be in person and everything. Others, and I'm one of those folks, I don't know if I'm ready for that. And I say that because, of course, we have to worry about COVID and the different variants, and there'll be something else after COVID. So how do we, now we have that extra layer of safety that we have to think about when we interact with others. And in terms
Yes.
of space, that's another thing for engaging. So, you know, I've seen the whole gamut where we went from everybody being in cubicles and offices to having this open concept, right? So only the senior leaders had offices, everybody else was in this open space. Well, how does that work with COVID? How are you going to socially distance? What if, you know, I'm vaccinated, you're not wearing a mask or whatever, and we're in this open space. So now organizations are having to rethink that. Oh my God, what does it look like? And then, you know, hoteling that some organizations have been doing for a while. So it used to be, you know, you have your office, you decorate your office, you have pictures of your kids, all that kind of stuff, right? It's your space. Well, what if that's not the case anymore? What if you reserve a space for a period of time because you want to be in, you know, Vicki and I want to come together. So this isn't my space anymore. It's just a space and I'm bringing myself to it. That's also a shift because a lot of people are attached. It's a, you know, a badge of honor to have that corner office or to have an office period, you know, to have your artwork up. And so we have to be conscious of that as well as the shifting nature of work and the remote work. What is that doing to how people see themselves or value themselves or want to be valued?
Yeah, that's a great example. I was just going to say that for us, it's a financial thing also. So, you know, as we have members move away from the central location, from a central facility, what do we do with the space that we have? Because some agencies, you pay rent based on the space and the footprint that you have. If I'm not paying rent for such a large footprint, now I can hire more individuals and bring more innovation and creativity to the workplace by investing my resources in the human element versus the physical space. So there's some upside and downside to you know, losing some of that physical space, but then maximizing the use of the human resources that you can get in with that same amount of funding that you have available.
Are there activities where you think that the value of face-to-face contact and work is so compelling that you're putting priority on these? So let me just give a couple of examples. 2-day meetings on Zoom are not, most of the times are not sort of inspiring events. Yes, people do it. Conflict, creativity, innovation, planning, and you know, there's. I also get the feeling that everybody's got, you know, here's the world sliced up into 1-hour slices that we can do quite well on video calls. It's amazing, really, what's been achieved. But then you've got a challenge, a problem, a change that is going to take days to figure out. And you know, we used to say, well, just lock them all in a room until they come up with a solution. Well, we can't, that's out. Can't really do that anymore. But do you see priority areas where people are saying, well, if we're going to address this challenge, we've got to get together face to face. No.
Vicki may have it. I do not see that. What I see is the reverse, people recognizing that for some employees, going back, it's just not going to happen in terms of going back face to face. So how do we get that emotion, that creativity? How do we do that remotely? And I think people are taking another look. I've seen organizations, several that I work with, use not downtime, but meetingless time, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a block of time that they make employees put on their calendars for no meetings, no telephone calls, no nothing. So you can get in a zone and focus and do work, because that going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting is exhausting. There are articles on the fact that humans are meant to take, cues from people. You could kind of do that better face to face. But if you've ever been in a Zoom meeting where people do not have their camera on, right? Because you have no cues, and it's really exhausting. At the end of the day, you're just drained. So fitting that in. And in terms of the creativity, letting to the best degree possible, kind of people, teams be self-managed. And so they know when they need to come together. Okay, great. They call each other. And sometimes I will pick up the phone, the old call somebody on the phone.
Yeah.
Then they don't feel like they have to be dressed. They have to be ready, right? They can be any kind of way. It's okay. I'm not going to see you. Let's just talk this out. So I think people, are rethinking instead of why the cases where we need to bring everybody in. Instead, how can we do this in a virtual environment?
Yeah. And Dan, I could not agree with Rhonda more. I don't think that those days are coming back. And one, because we are so geographically separated from each other, and the cost of flying people in across the country, when I think that even from a strategic planning perspective, even, what are we going to do next week from a short term? I think that we can do that through technology. And the reason I say that is we offer 6-month leader development programs on Zoom. And we have been so successful in the last 18 months. What we try to do is we break them into smaller chunks during the day. It used to be you'd come in, you spend 40 hours in class, 8 hours a day, then you fly back home. So now we take that 40-hour chunk of time and we make micro learnings out of them. We give them more work that they can do on their own, and then we bring them together in a group. So we've gone to a more blended approach to learning. And I can tell you that the end of course evaluations have been exceptional. I mean, there's one or two that says, I wish we could have sat down together. But I just don't think that those days are coming back.
Okay. And that's interesting that both of you have a perspective that this face-to-face thing is over, basically. There's not any reason for it. There's diverse, perspectives and opinions on that. But this is really interesting because the message is loud and clear. We need to recreate everything that we can in a virtual mode so that it works, and learn how to do this and work with what we've got. And that may put some real barriers to the whole person. That may drive a real wedge between people that are doing what they, at the beginning of the pandemic, called essential jobs, where they have to be face-to-face. It may have some consequences, but even at the planning, creativity, innovation level, you guys just don't see it coming back. And that's an important one, to take a deep breath and say, okay, so now how do we make this work?
Yeah. Right. And that's the challenge, is how do we make sure that our frontline workers who cannot be virtual, who cannot be remote, who have to be out on the dams and in the fisheries and in the parks, value work. How do we value the work that they bring to the table, just like we do our remote employees? An example is at the end of the month, this month, my team, which I told you is all over the US, we're doing a end of summer luau. And so, everybody's
All
coming
right.
here and everybody has to wear a luau shirt. They had to provide, pictures for what they did over the summer. Babies were born, all kind of things have happened. So we're going to celebrate all of their successes and then all of their challenges that they've had at our end of summer luau as we prepare to close out our physical year. Normally we would be in the workplace and we'd be crunching to end all of our contracts and get all of that heavy work done by the 30th
Right.
of September. But now all of that's going to be done in a virtual environment. So we're going to come together and celebrate the end of summer and then think about what we're going to do for the next 6 months or so to keep everybody engaged. Because the one thing about a hybrid workplace is employee engagement is extremely important. And I think leaders have had to step up and understand that they are responsible for reaching out to their
Yes.
employees, not just the
Yes.
ones down the hall that they can go
Right.
to, because we still have people that are, quote, in the workplace, because as Rhonda mentioned, some people just like to have that face-to-face interaction. But for the most part, I can tell you that those times are probably in the past.
Yeah, I
And
think you're right, Vicki, and someone typed into the chat as well, those opportunities to just interact with staff, put work aside. We have done virtual picnics that, have ended up really well. And there's been a physical component, like exercise. So, we had line dancing. So, tutorial on the screen, and then everybody, hey, if you want, show your camera, let's see you practicing. Do happy hours. In fact, I have one this afternoon with my staff, and I told them to wear something, their favorite piece of clothing that they haven't been able to wear due to COVID. So it could be a team jersey because you haven't been to a team game. It could be a ball gown because you haven't gone to any formal events or whatever. So we're just going to make it, a fun event. And as someone mentioned in the chat, I've done this before, coffee, tea, and we call it Diet Pepsi because one member of my staff drinks Diet Pepsi in the morning. So you come and you chat. It's a half an hour. Hey, what's going on? What happened? Like you said, celebrate some successes, but really get to know each other and build those bonds outside of the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
That's so
great.
key.
This is really interesting, and the time's flying by. But I want to take some time for some questions.